The small-town diner sat alone under the dim glow of its neon sign, flickering like a tired heartbeat against the vast darkness of the open highway. The roads stretched endlessly, empty except for the occasional passing truck, its headlights slicing through the night. Inside, the scent of sizzling fries and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mixing with the quiet chatter of a few late-night customers. The walls were lined with faded pictures, and an old jukebox sat in the corner, humming a soft tune that no one really listened to. It was the kind of place where faces rarely changed, where the same regulars occupied the same booths, night after night. Tonight, however, an unfamiliar presence stepped inside. The door creaked open, and heads turned. A tall, broad-shouldered man entered, his steps slow and steady, as if he had been on the road for hours. His name was Elijah Carter, and though few recognized him, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen more than his fair share of fights, both in and out of the ring. He wasn't here for trouble. He wasn't here for attention. All he wanted was a warm meal before continuing his long journey. Elijah slid into a corner booth, his back to the wall, and picked up the menu. The laminated pages crinkled between his fingers as he scanned the options, but he already knew what he wanted: something simple, something filling. The soft hum of the diner returned. The whispers lingered. Who was he? Where was he from? He didn't look like the type to pass through this town. But just as quickly as the curiosity sparked, people returned to their meals. Outside, the wind howled through the parking lot, rattling the street signs. Unbeknownst to Elijah, a group of bikers had just arrived, their motorcycles roaring like thunder before they cut their engines. The leader, a burly man named Travis Kane, leaned against his bike, lighting a cigarette with a slow, deliberate flick of his lighter. His cold eyes fixed on the diner's entrance as he exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. "Who's the new guy?" one of his men muttered, nodding toward the window. Travis smirked. "Doesn't matter. He'll know soon enough. This town ain't for strangers." Laughter rippled through the group, low and mean. They weren't just any bikers. This was the Iron Fangs, a gang known for ruling the town with fear. Their nights were spent drinking, intimidating locales, and looking for someone to remind who was in charge. And tonight, Elijah Carter had unknowingly walked right into their territory. Inside the diner, the waitress approached Elijah's table, hesitating for a moment before pulling out her notepad. She was young, barely in her 20s, with tired eyes that darted nervously toward the window. She had seen the bikers outside, and she knew what they were capable of. Something about tonight felt different. Something about tonight felt dangerous. Outside the diner, the night felt heavier, the air thick with the scent of gasoline and smoke. The parking lot, dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp, was now occupied by a row of motorcycles, their chrome gleaming under the weak yellow light. The riders leaned against their bikes, their leather jackets worn and scuffed, their voices low but sharp with laughter. At the center of them stood their leader, Grant Walker. Grant wasn't just any biker. He was the kind of man who thrived on fear. With a scar running down his cheek and a cold, calculating stare, he had built his reputation on violence. The town knew better than to cross him, and those who did regretted it. He ruled with an iron grip, making sure no one forgot who was in charge. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man named Rick, nudged Grant and gestured toward the diner's window. "Check him out," he muttered. Grant followed his gaze, his expression unreadable as he spotted the unfamiliar man sitting alone in the booth. Elijah Carter. He didn't look like the usual travelers who passed through this one stoplight town. There was something about him, something calm, controlled, like he had been through storms and come out the other side stronger. "Who is he?" another biker asked. Grant took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaling the smoke into the cold air. "Doesn't matter," he said. "He's in the wrong place." The gang chuckled, their voices dripping with cruel amusement. To them, Elijah was just another outsider, another man who needed to be reminded that strangers weren't welcome here. They had spent the evening drinking, their blood hot with liquor and bad intentions. And now, with nothing else to entertain them, they had found their next target. Inside the diner, the waitress, Emily, stole another glance toward the window, her stomach twisting into knots. She had lived in this town her whole life. She had seen what the Iron Fangs were capable of. They weren't just loud troublemakers, they were dangerous. And now they had their eyes on the quiet man in the booth. She hesitated before walking toward Elijah's table. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her notepad. He looked up at her, his expression calm but knowing. He could sense something was wrong. "You ready to order?" she asked, forcing a smile. Elijah nodded. "Just a burger and coffee." His voice was steady, unbothered, but his eyes flickered toward the window for just a second. He wasn't blind to the tension in the air. Outside, Grant tossed his cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his boot. "Let's go say hello," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. The gang pushed off their bikes and moved toward the diner, their boots crunching against the gravel. The door creaked as they stepped inside, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere. Conversations died down, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Emily took a small step back, gripping her notepad tightly. She knew what was coming. Grant's gaze locked onto Elijah, his smirk widening. The game had begun. The diner grew quieter as Grant and his gang settled in. The loud chatter that had filled the air just moments before now seemed distant. Elijah stayed focused on his menu, but he couldn't ignore the heavy footsteps echoing across the floor. Grant and his crew took over the counter and some nearby tables, making sure everyone noticed their presence. They weren't here for food, they were here for a reason. Emily, the waitress, felt the weight of their eyes on her. She had worked in this diner for years and had seen her fair share of trouble. But tonight felt different. It wasn't just the bikers, it was something about Elijah, something about the way he sat there, calm and unbothered by the gang's noise. The way he held himself made her think he wasn't scared. And that scared her more. One of the bikers, a tall guy with a shaved head named Jake, leaned over to Grant, his voice low and rough. "You think he's one of those guys who doesn't know his place?" Grant shrugged, his cold eyes never leaving Elijah. "If he doesn't know, we'll make sure he does." Emily moved around the room, trying to keep busy, but her nerves were getting the best of her. She had seen the gang pick fights with other customers before, and every time, it ended badly. She had been lucky so far, but tonight, she wasn't sure how things would go. Elijah finally looked up from the menu, his eyes meeting Emily's for just a second. She forced a smile, but it was shaky. He nodded, then looked back at the menu as if nothing was wrong. But Emily knew better. The gang grew louder, and their laughter bounced off the walls. Grant and his men were enjoying themselves, making snide comments, throwing glances toward Elijah. It wasn't just about getting food anymore. It was about intimidating the stranger in their town. "Bet you $100, he's some rich guy passing through," Jake muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Too bad he doesn't know who runs this town." Grant chuckled, but his gaze never left Elijah. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms behind his head. "He's in for a surprise." Emily's hands shook as she grabbed a coffee pot and refilled a nearby cup. Her heart raced as she glanced at Elijah again. He hadn't reacted to the taunts. He just sat there like nothing was happening. But that didn't make the situation better. It made it worse. As the bikers continued to mock Elijah from across the room, Emily felt a lump form in her throat. What if things went wrong? What if the gang didn't stop at taunts and started something worse? She couldn't just stand by and let it happen. She had to do something. But what? Grant stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The noise made the room go still and all. Eyes turned to him. With a smirk on his face, he made his way toward Elijah's booth, his boots thudding heavily with each step. The room held its breath. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She wanted to say something, to stop him, but she was frozen. The tension in the air was thick, like everyone in the diner was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Grant reached the booth and leaned down close to Elijah, his voice low but clear. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his tone dripping with venom. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from his menu. "I'm just here for some food," he said calmly, his voice steady. Grant's lips twisted into a cruel grin. "You think you can just come into our town and act like you own it?" He sneered, his breath hot against Elijah's ear. "We don't like strangers here, especially ones who think they're better than the rest of us. Emily's hands were sweating now as she stood behind the counter, watching the scene unfold. She wanted to step in, to say something, but she knew better. Grant and his gang didn't listen to anyone except each other. But just as the tension seemed ready to break, something unexpected happened. Elijah looked up, meeting Grant's gaze for the first time. His expression was unreadable, calm even, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Grant hesitate. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was just calm. Grant stared at him, trying to figure out what to do next. For a moment, the room was still, the air thick with uncertainty. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, Grant turned away and walked back to his table, muttering something under his breath. But even though the immediate confrontation had ended, the tension in the diner didn't lift. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm that was still waiting to break. Everyone knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air outside the diner was cold and still, with only the hum of the neon sign and the distant chirp of crickets breaking the silence. Elijah stood up from his booth, carefully placing the empty plate on the table. His meal was done, and it was time to leave, but as he moved toward the door, something didn't feel right. The tension inside the diner had been thick, like a storm waiting to break, and now, outside, it felt like that storm was following him. He could feel the eyes of Grant and his gang on him as he stepped out into the night. The door chimed softly behind him, but Elijah didn't look back. He kept walking toward his car, the gravel crunching under his boots with each step. But he could sense it, the shift in the air. Something was wrong. He didn't need to look over his shoulder to know the bikers were following him. He could hear their heavy boots pounding behind him, their laughter low and mocking. His car was just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to the trap that was being set for him. Grant and his gang were getting closer, their voices louder now. The sound of their motorcycles revving in the parking lot was like an engine of doom, their growls mixing with the sound of their footsteps as they circled around him. Elijah's heart rate stayed steady, his steps calm. He wasn't afraid, but he was alert. Grant, walking ahead of the gang, stepped in front of Elijah, blocking his path. His eyes locked onto Elijah's, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "You think you can just walk through our town like you own it?" Grant sneered, his voice low and dangerous. Elijah stopped, his expression unchanged. He looked Grant in the eye but didn't speak right away. His muscles tensed, ready for whatever was coming, but his face remained calm, almost bored. Grant took another step forward, closing the gap between them. "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice dripping with hatred. Elijah knew what was about to happen. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to intimidate him, and it wouldn't be the last. But he wasn't here to fight. He just wanted to leave. He finally spoke, his voice steady and controlled. "You don't want to do this." Grant didn't listen. Instead, he pulled out a chain from his belt, swinging it in his hand like it was nothing more than a toy. His gang was watching, eager for the fight to start. Elijah didn't move an inch. He wasn't backing down, but he wasn't rushing in either. "You hear that, boys?" Grant barked to the others. "He thinks he can talk his way out of this." He raised the chain and swung it toward Elijah, the heavy metal glinting in the moonlight. But Elijah was faster. With a quick sidestep, he dodged the chain, the link missing him by mere inches. The gang gasped, stunned by his speed. It wasn't what they had expected. Grant's face twisted in anger, and he lunged forward again, this time with the chain aimed directly at Elijah's chest. But Elijah had already moved. In a blur of motion, he stepped aside, his fist flying out, connecting with Grant's jaw. The impact was sharp and precise, and Grant stumbled back, his teeth gritted in pain. The other bikers rushed forward, yelling, but Elijah was ready. He didn't waste time. His punches came fast and hard, each one landing with the speed and force of a trained fighter. One by one, the bikers tried to attack, but Elijah was too quick. His fists seemed to have a mind of their own, knocking the wind out of the gang members with every hit. "Get him!" Grant shouted from the side, but his voice was shaky now, panic creeping into his words. One biker lunged at Elijah with a bottle in his hand, but Elijah ducked under it and spun, knocking the man to the ground with a swift elbow to the back. Another tried to grab him from behind, but Elijah twisted free and kicked him in the stomach, sending him flying backward. Grant, still recovering from the first punch, was watching his gang fall one by one. His anger was turning into fear. He pulled out a knife, his hands shaking as he gripped the handle tightly. "You think you can beat all of us?" he yelled, stepping toward Elijah with the blade raised. Elijah didn't flinch. With the same calm control he had used throughout the fight, he sidestepped the knife swing and grabbed Grant's arm, twisting it with expert precision. The knife dropped to the ground with a loud clatter, and Grant crumpled to his knees, groaning in pain. The gang, seeing their leader on the ground, hesitated. The men who had been so eager to fight now looked unsure, their bravado slipping away as they realized they had underestimated the man they had tried to provoke. Elijah took a step back, his breathing steady, his stance still ready. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The bikers were defeated, their pride shattered in a matter of minutes. They had come here looking for a fight, but now they were the ones who were beaten. As the sirens of the approaching police cars grew louder in the distance, the bikers scrambled to get up, their earlier bravado gone. They tried to regain their composure, but it was too late. They had lost. The sound of police sirens echoed in the parking lot, growing louder with each passing second. Elijah stood in the middle of the chaos, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The bikers who had once seemed so sure of themselves were now scattered on the ground, some groaning, others barely able to move. Grant, their leader, was slumped in a corner, nursing his shoulder where Elijah's punch had landed. The gang had come looking for a fight, but what they hadn't expected was a man who knew exactly how to defend himself. The sheriff's car skidded to a stop in the parking lot. His boots clicked sharply against the pavement as he surveyed the scene. Elijah didn't move. He didn't need to. The sheriff had seen things like this before. He walked up to Elijah, eyeing the calm, collected man standing among the wreckage of Grant's gang. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Elijah nodded, his face still unreadable. "Just had to defend myself," he said simply. The sheriff looked around at the bikers, who were now slowly getting to their feet. Their cocky attitudes were gone, replaced by the clear signs of fear. Grant, who had once been the proud leader of the gang, was now nursing a cut on his lip, his eyes darting around, trying to figure out how things had gone so wrong. The sheriff stepped forward and took out a pair of handcuffs, slapping them onto Grant's wrists without a word. The gang leader didn't resist. His anger now turned to disbelief. The other bikers looked at each other nervously as they, too, were handcuffed and escorted to the sheriff's car. The gang was rounded up and taken away. Elijah stayed where he was, leaning against his car. His eyes were distant, staring out into the night. The neon lights from the diner flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow across the parking lot. He wasn't looking at the bikers or the sheriff anymore. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the moments before the fight had broken out. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to get involved in a fight or make enemies. But sometimes, that's just how things went. He had been on the road for hours, just trying to get some rest and a meal. He never expected the situation to escalate the way it had, but when push came to shove, Elijah knew he couldn't back down. He wasn't afraid of fighting, but it wasn't his first choice. He just wanted to be left alone. The sheriff came back to Elijah, his steps slow but purposeful. He looked at Elijah for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind, then gave a small nod. "You handled yourself well," he said, his tone more respectful now. Elijah didn't respond right away. He didn't need praise, especially not for something like this. He had done what anyone would have done in his position. "Thanks," Elijah finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I just didn't want it to go this far." The sheriff nodded again, understanding in his eyes. "I get it," he said, his voice softer now. "But sometimes, you don't get to decide how things go. It's just the way life works." Elijah didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't looking for a lesson. He wasn't looking for anything, really, except peace. But peace wasn't always possible. The sheriff left to follow his men to the squad car. Elijah took a deep breath. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. He had fought before, but this felt different. He hadn't just defended himself from some random attack. He had taken on an entire group of people who had judged him simply because of who he was. And in the end, it hadn't been about strength or fighting. It had been about standing up for himself and not letting anyone walk all over him. The bikers might have lost the fight, but it wasn't just about the physical confrontation. It was about sending a message that Elijah wasn't someone to be intimidated. As the sheriff's car pulled away, Elijah looked up at the diner. Its lights flickered in the distance, but Elijah's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the fight anymore. He was thinking about everything else, the way people saw each other, how quickly judgments were made, and how hard it was to change the way people thought. The fight outside the diner hadn't been about a simple disagreement or a misunderstanding. It had been about something deeper, something that ran through the heart of the town and through Elijah's own life. Prejudice. Hatred. Fear of the unknown. As he drove away, the diner's lights grew smaller in his rearview mirror. The sounds of the world around him seemed to fade as he focused on the road ahead. He wasn't just leaving the town behind. He was leaving behind the reminder that no matter how far you go, no matter how hard you try, there's always something or someone waiting to make you prove yourself. For Elijah, the fight was over. But the larger battle against prejudice, against hate, against judgment was just beginning. And he would continue to fight it, wherever it took him. The next day, word of what happened outside the diner spread like wildfire. People in the small town couldn't stop talking about the fight that had taken place. At first, many had been shocked, not because of the fight itself, but because of who had been involved. They'd all seen the bikers around town, causing trouble here and there. But Elijah? No one had expected him to be the one to stand up to them, especially not in the way he had. Some people couldn't believe what they had heard. They'd seen the bikers as the tough guys in town, the ones who took what they wanted and scared anyone who dared to challenge them. And then there was Elijah, a man they barely knew, who had been quiet and unassuming during his short time there. It wasn't just about what had happened in the parking lot. Elijah had taken down the gang without breaking a sweat. It was a message they couldn't ignore. As the news spread, some people started to call Elijah a hero. The sheriff even made a statement thanking him for handling the situation without letting things get out of control. In a way, Elijah had become a symbol for something bigger, someone who wouldn't let fear keep him down, someone who wasn't afraid to fight back when the time came. But Elijah didn't see it that way. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. To him, he had just done what was necessary. He hadn't looked for a fight, but sometimes, when life put you in a corner, you had no choice but to stand your ground. He wasn't thinking about the praise or the recognition. He had just been trying to get through the night. He sat in his car later that afternoon, parked by the side of the road, watching the town go by. His thoughts were clouded with everything that had happened. He hadn't expected the bikers to react the way they did. They had pushed him into a corner, and in that moment, he had to act. But what troubled him most wasn't the fight itself. It was how quickly things had escalated. How one wrong word, one wrong move, could turn a peaceful evening into chaos. And what bothered him even more was how quickly people made judgments about him, simply because of who he was. The bikers had made their assumptions the moment they saw him walk into the diner. They didn't know him. They didn't know his story, but that didn't matter. To them, he was just another outsider. Just another person who didn't belong. And that was all the reason they needed to start trouble. But the town's response was different. Some people now saw him as someone who stood up for what was right, someone who fought against the hate that had been growing in the shadows for too long. But even that didn't sit well with Elijah. He didn't want to be celebrated just for standing up for himself. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to live his life without having to prove anything to anyone. Elijah wasn't sure what the future held for him in this town. He knew he wasn't planning on staying long. He had never planned on sticking around in any place for too long. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. And when it did, he couldn't just walk away. As he drove through the streets, the weight of the situation started to sink in. The bikers were gone now, arrested and taken away. The town had calmed down. But Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. There was still something lurking beneath the surface. something that would need to be addressed if things were ever truly going to change. The fight had been won, but the war against hatred, against ignorance, was still going on. And Elijah knew that it wasn't something that could be solved in one night or even one fight. It was something that would take time, it would take effort, and it would take people being willing to change their minds, to see things differently. But Elijah wasn't sure if he was ready to be the one to make that change. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want to be the one everyone looked to for answers. He just wanted to be left alone. He wanted to get back on the road, leave this town behind, and keep moving. As he continued driving, the town slowly faded in his rearview mirror. The streets grew quieter, the noise of the world fading away. But Elijah knew that no matter how far he went, no matter how much he tried to escape, there would always be something waiting for him. People would always judge him, would always try to put him in a box. But he had learned something that night. He had learned that he didn't have to let others define him, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.